thank you for this wonderful workshop, Johanna and Kamran and the Global Quran team. Is really, I feel very humbled to be among such an outstanding group of scholars and to have some small role to play in this workshop. So before I get into the heart of my presentation, let me just begin by sort of showing you where we're going. I've got three movements to this talk. First, some definitions and scholarly background. Brief introduction to the lives of Daryabadi and Nadwi. And then the question of my paper, and if you look at the abstract, is why Daryabadi? Why did Nadwi so strongly endorse the Quran translation, and particularly the commentary, the English Quran translation and commentary of Abdul Majid Daryabadi? So first, some definitions and background. I don't need to define dawah for this group. There's some information on the screen for you. I'm sure we all are on the same page with that. A newer term that I do want to also introduce, though, is this term daology, which I use in some of my work. By daology, I mean the efforts of Muslim activists and thinkers to delineate dawah with reference to the Islamic sources and to explore how it ought to be carried out. Daologies are articulated or sometimes unarticulated principles and beliefs that inform or undergird dawah practice. So just keep that in mind. I think we could probably debate the usefulness of this category, but that's a basic definition to at least inform our conversation. The third piece of background is a bit more theoretical. One of the main lenses of analysis I employ in my work and also in today's paper, and that has come up already in several of the papers, and I think is going to keep coming up in our discussion, is that of interreligious, and we might add intra-religious relations. One finds that modern Islamic movements, like I would suggest the religion itself from its earliest days, have been constituted not only with respect to the Islamic sources, not only in relation to their historical contexts, but also in relation to other religions. In saying this, I follow an insight of the late sociologist Martin Riesebrot, whose theoretical work has really helped me in my own thinking on this. He writes in one of his books, religions constitute themselves in relation to each other. In contrast to the sort of undergraduate syllabus, every semester I teach world religions, and my syllabus can give the impression that religions are sort of hermetically sealed categories: Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism. But in fact, religions are always in the real world jostling, bumping up against each other, and in fact, shaping each other in those interactions. On the one hand, he writes, religions often become conscious of themselves by demarcating themselves from and arguing against other religions. And this happens both interreligiously and intra-religiously. On the other hand, interacting religions also borrow elements of one another and assimilate to one another. In trying to explain these concepts to my undergraduate students, I sometimes use the example of sibling relationships. Some of us who have siblings, perhaps we understand this. Our sibling liked that thing, so I'm going to like something different, demarcation. My sibling plays that sport, so I'm going to play something different. My sibling likes that instrument, I'm going to play a different instrument. We try to establish an independent sense of self and identity through a process of demarcation. But we can't help but also assimilate, imitate, copy, be like, share genetics with our siblings. And so demarcation and assimilation, I think, are really interesting ways to think about religious history in general, but particularly Islamic history in the modern period. So that's part one, some background and definitions. So now let's turn to our two thinkers today, Daryabadi and Nadwi. First, Daryabadi. According to Humaira Ziad, Daryabadi was, quote, a North Indian Muslim modernist, pan-Islamist, literateur, magazine publisher, and born-again believer. Interesting choice of words. Indeed, having been born into a family of religious scholars and civil servants and having received a traditional early education, he went on to study European philosophy in Lucknow, Allahabad, and Aligarh. Out of these student days, Daryabadi reports in his own Urdu biography, Aap Biti, that he had a 10-year period of distancing. Some have called it atheism. I'm not sure if it was really atheism, if he really stopped believing in God altogether, but in any case, he had a period of a heightened rationalism, you might say skepticism, in which he was distanced from the faith of his childhood. Around 1918, however, he experienced a dramatic reconversion to what we might call an evangelical or dawah-minded Islam. Some of the varied influences in bringing this about include Daryabadi's reading of the medieval Sufi, Rumi, a relationship with Deobandi luminary Ashraf Ali Thanwi, the example of the missionary zeal of the Ahmadiyya movement, and one of its key members, Muhammad Ali, who's come up several times today as a pioneering English Quran translator. This is the same Muhammad Ali who had translated the Quran into English, published in 1917. All of this impressed Daryabadi, even though he would, of course, disavow Ali's Ahmadi beliefs. For a time, Daryabadi was also impressed with and connected with Maududi, but he later distanced himself from Jamaat-e-Islami, interestingly, as did Nadwi in his own formation. That came up out of order, sorry about that. Indeed, just as Muhammad Ali and also Maududi had pursued journalism as a means of dawah in the colonial situation, so Daryabadi embarked on an accomplished journalistic career in which he wrote for and edited a number of Urdu journals. He was also a prolific author of many books and other works. By the time of his death in 1977, he had authored well over 50 works, including probably his most famous, in Urdu Qur'an translation and commentary, and of course our subject, in English Qur'an translation and commentary. So let me zoom in and say a little more then about Daryabadi's Tafsir ul-Qur'an. Sometime in the mid to late 1920s, Daryabadi was persuaded by several leaders, including Thanwi, to take up the task of Qur'an translation in English, which would specifically serve the needs of dawah in the colonial situation. Begun in 1933 and completed by 1940, I couldn't get an exact date on that, Daryabadi's translation and commentary went through a complicated process of publication, which I'm not going to delay us by talking about. It was finally published in full in 1957, and look at this interesting title, as the Holy Qur'an, translated from the original Arabic with lexical, grammatical, historical, geographical, and eschatological comments and explanations, and, very importantly, sidelights on comparative religion. So notice that Daryabadi himself highlighted comparative religion in the original title. And indeed, among other Muslims who have weighed in favor of Daryabadi's English commentary, his focus on comparative religion is almost always mentioned as a leading factor. Let me give 3 examples. Many of you who have studied Daryabadi are probably aware that Maryam Jamila, the well-known and powerful dawah writer and activist, endorsed to some extent Daryabadi's commentary in these words. She writes, after reading Pickfall's rendition, I discovered other English translations by Yusuf Ali, Muhammad Ali Lahori, and Abdul Majid Daryabadi. I found the commentary by Yusuf Ali and Muhammad Ali Lahori offensive because of their apologetic tone and unconvincing attempts to explain away those passages conflicting with modern science. She goes on, although Maulana Daryabadi's attempts to pattern his translation of the Holy Qur'an on the archaic style of the King James Version of the Bible most annoyed me, I like her directness here, I found his commentary excellent, particularly those parts dealing with comparative religion, and learned much from it. However, Pickfall's rendition remained my favorite. Example 2. I first came into contact with Daryabadi's translation through Zakir Naik. I did some of my own PhD dissertation research on Dr. Zakir Naik, and so I watched literally every speech he's ever given, and not quite literally, but I watched most of the speeches. And in one of his talks, the Quran, should it be read with understanding, he gives at the end of one of those talks a list of his favorite Quran translations in English. And very interestingly, here's his list. Yusuf Ali comes in first, Sahih International, Halal Khan, and coming in number 4, Daryabadi. If I had time, I would play you the clip, but I'll just tell you what he said. He says, basically, Daryabadi is good, and he says, because it is good for comparative religion. That's why it comes in number 4 on his list. A third example is a more scholarly approach, and this comes from actually Daryabadi's grandchild, A.R. Kidwai, who writes this: another hallmark of Daryabadi's commentary is the abundance of material on comparative religion. gleaned painstakingly from mostly primary sources. Indeed, I think that's an accurate assessment. So that's three assessments. That's three assessments of Daryabadi's achievement, but there's a fourth, and it's the strong endorsement of Sayyid Abu'l-Hasan Ali Nadwi, which we'll come back to in just a minute. So let me say a few more things about Tafsir al-Qur'an. So I mentioned that it was begun in 1933, finally published in full in 1957. In passing, let me say one more thing about these assessments. We might note that these assessments, and again, this has come up in several of our discussions today, these assessments illustrate a really interesting point about contemporary Quran translation and dawah. Namely, that it is not only Quran translation itself that has blossomed in modernity, but also critical reflection on Quran translation, and sometimes very interesting and enlightening discussions about which translations are best or most suitable. So coming back to Tafsir al-Qur'an, following the initial publication in the late 1950s, Daryabadi's English translation and commentary was given new life through a condensed single volume version published by the Islamic Foundation in Britain, and prior to that, in a more complete 4-volume version published by the Lucknow-based Academy of Islamic Research, associated with none other than Abu'l-Hasan Ali Nadwi. And I have the 4-volume set here. This is the set I relied upon in my research for this paper. I was not able to get a copy of the original 1957. I do understand that there were some revisions made, but I was not able to sort of explore that. I think the revisions were light, and one piece of evidence for that is there's an appendix provided in, I think, volume 3, where Nadwi himself corrects something that Daryabadi had said in one of his notes regarding Alexander the Great. And so the fact that they left Daryabadi's note as it was, but then provided this appendix to correct it, perhaps suggests that they mostly left the commentary alone in this later edition. Now, it's worth pausing and repeating something that we've already noted. It was the time in which Daryabadi was working on this translation. And by the way, if you look at the commentary, sometimes Daryabadi will even quote newspaper articles that he's come across, say in the Lucknow Pioneer or the Times of India, and all of those come from the 1930s. So he's very much living in the shadow of the British Raj. It's still the era of colonialism. The British Raj perhaps is fading, but it's the British Raj, and it's an era of, as we've already heard today, a lot of competitive religious pluralism. All right, moving right along. Sure enough, as we look at Daryabadi's commentary, it is strongly reflected not only of traditional beliefs, but also of this colonial context. I just want to show you over the next few slides some of the sources, for example, that Daryabadi relies upon. I don't have time to sort of talk about all these things, but here's the list at the beginning of the translation and commentary of sources that he's only going to use abbreviations for, whether you have Shah Abdul Qadir, you've got Maududi, you've got the Encyclopedia Britannica, you've got the Gospel of Barnabas, Jewish Encyclopedia, Lane, all these things are here. But these are just things that he quotes by using these abbreviations. Other sources that he uses throughout the work, he often quotes Thomas Arnold's The Preaching of Islam and the Legacy of Islam. He does sometimes quote from Wary's commentary and translation. He quotes William James a number of times on Varieties of Religious Experience. Robertson Smith, Catherine Mayo. Very, very interesting. Several times he quotes writings of Samuel Zwingli as contained in the Muslim World. He quotes Muir quite frequently as well. So it's a very interesting dialogue he's carrying, and not only with the Bible and biblical material, not only with Jewish sources, but also with a whole range of Western literature. Others here you can see, I was quite interested in Daryabadi's interaction with Wilhelm Schmidt, The Origin and Growth of Religion. Schmidt had argued that the earliest religion of humankind is monotheism, that in a sense polytheism is that rather than the evolutionary model of religions, it's more of a devolutionary model, that religions devolve from that primordial monotheism. And that's something that Daryabadi found useful for his own argument. Again, even more. sources here. Two sources that I found quite interesting is that a book called The Bible is True and a book called The Accuracy of the Bible. Very interesting, although Daryabadi is very quick to show many places where the Quran corrects the Bible, he yet uses these sources that were published by authors intending to sort of back up the validity of the Bible by recent, as of the 1930s, archaeological discoveries. And so these books are also quoted by Marston and Yehuda quite frequently. And then, of course, he quotes Yusuf Ali. When Yusuf Ali is quoted, it's AYA. So there's a lot of direct quotes from AYA. He quotes Muhammad Asad. He quotes, all kinds of sources that you can see here. All right, now let's turn to Nadwi. So how am I doing on time? Okay, let's turn to Nadwi. Abu'l-Hasan Ali Nadwi was not only among the 20th century's most prominent Sunni Muslim scholars and activists in his home country of India, but also throughout the Muslim world in general. According to Muhammad Qasim Zaman, Nadwi was the most prominent Indian Muslim scholar of his generation and one of the leading Sunni ulama on the international scene in the second half of the 20th century. Nadwi was an outstanding example of a North Indian alim cum Sufi who studied under some of the great Ahl Hadith and Deobandi scholars of the day. In his lifetime, he authored more than 180 books in Urdu, Arabic, and English, several of which gained international recognition. Of these, probably none was more important than Nadwi's 1950 blockbuster, Mada Khasr al-Alam bi Inhitat al-Muslimin, translated into English as Islam and the World. Interestingly, this book, later editions of this book had a foreword written by none other than Sayyid Qutb. For 40 years, he was the head of the madrasa of the Nadwat al-Ulama in Lucknow. And interestingly, too, he was a supporter and participant in the influential global Dawah movement, the Tablighi Jamaat, and a biographer of TJ founder Maulana Muhammad Ilyas. While overseeing the madrasa in Lucknow, Nadwi kept up a feverish travel and writing schedule and played an important role in the founding of several major Islamic organizations. But for our purposes, tucked away in Nadwi's vast corpus is a recommendation, an endorsement of Daryabadi's English translation and commentary as, quote, the most reliable. So what I want to do is just show you a few of the key lines from this endorsement. I should start by reading a little bit from, this is from Nadwi's introduction to the 1981 edition. Nadwi writes this. He writes, translations of the Holy Quran in English can be divided into two categories. First, there are those penned either by non-Muslim Orientalists or by those Muslim apologists who were unduly impressed by the political ascendancy and industrial advancement of the West, such as the Qadiani exegetes. So he kind of sets that aside. He sets aside the Orientalist translations and the Qadianis. Then he says, among the translators and exegetes of the second group, the translation and commentary of Yusuf Ali was received popularly. His rendering of the Quranic verses in blank verse, sort of he goes on. Then he has a little bit of a critique of that. He talks about Pickthall. He likes Pickthall, but not that much. And then he goes on to say this. There was then the need for another English translation of the Quran, complete with explanatory notes, which could be recommended with confidence to Muslims and non-Muslims. Now he goes into a long list of criteria for what this translation needed to be. And I added the numbers here, by the way. The author needed to, one, expound the Quran text in terms acceptable to scholars of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, while avoid putting forward his own views and ideas into the exegesis, be fully conversant with Arabic lexicon. Number 4, to have faith in life after death and the rewards and retributions promised in the Quran, to have studied all the classical and modern commentaries, to expound the significance of the Quranic injunctions in regard to polygamy, slavery, dowry, execution of apostates, blood money, etc. Taking all these factors into account, Abdul Majid Daryabadi's translation and commentary is undoubtedly unique and most acceptable among all the exegetical readings of the Holy Quran so far attempted in the English language. A very strong endorsement. He goes on, he has even more to say. I'm not going to bother to read all this, but the final line, he repeats it again. His translation and commentary is, to my mind, unique and most reliable among all translations and commentaries of the Quran so far attempted in the English language. Okay, I'm going to skip over this slide. where in this slide, I just review previous scholarship on Nadwi, and I suggest that maybe his life should also be reviewed and studied in light of his dawah and daology. So then let's come to number 3. Why Daryabadi? Why did Nadwi, this important alim of the 20th century, he died in 1999, why did he favor the English translation of Daryabadi? What I want to do is conclude with 5 observations of his daology, coming back to that concept. There's a lot more that could be said about Nadwi's daology, but five categories that I think interface nicely with why Daryabadi would be attractive to him. First, for Nadwi, and I take this from a detailed study of Nadwi's Urdu biography written by his nephew, and also a range of Nadwi's own works, and then also interfacing that with my reading of Daryabadi. Dawah should be based on confidence in and knowledge of scripture. Nadwi was certainly saturated in Islamic scripture from his childhood and studied the Quran and Hadith under leading Indian ulama as a young man. Go back to that. Given his upbringing and education, it is not surprising that Nadwi believed that only when Muslims returned directly to the teachings and precedents of the Quran and Sunnah would their dawah be successful. Like Daryabadi, Nadwi is anxious to defend the Quran, on the one hand, from Muslims who seem to him embarrassed about the Quran's pre-modern worldview and reports of miracles, and on the other, Western critics who reduced the Quran to nothing more than a human compilation of pre-existing texts. This bold scripturalism is surely one area in which Nadwi found Daryabadi to be a kindred spirit. I found dozens of examples of Daryabadi defending the real miracles of the Quran and also contradicting the views of Western critics, very often using critics against themselves. He'll often say things like, despite being a harsh critic of Islam, even Wary or Torrey or Bosworth Smith or MacDonald or Muir, and so on, admit such and such a good thing about the Quran and Islam. Secondly, dawah should be the concern of all Muslims, not just the scholars, and ordinary Muslims should be equipped to do it. Like Daryabadi, Nadwi believed that the Quran contained timeless dawah principles. For instance, in his book, Inviting to the Way of Allah, Nadwi finds in the Quran dawah precedents that he believes are relevant still today. The dawah of the Quranic prophets, Nadwi says, was perfectly suited to each of his hearers, and each prophet knew just the right moment to turn the conversation to tawheed. This, asserts Nadwi, is precisely what is needed today. Nadwi, however, does not limit himself to the dawah of the Quran's prophets. To convince the ordinary Muslim that dawah is his or her responsibility, he also speaks and talks about the ordinary believer found in Surah Al-Ghafir, the 40th chapter of the Quran. Nadwi writes that the believer of Surah Al-Ghafir provides a fine example of one calling to Allah who is not a prophet. We can learn much from him and deduce many valuable principles in calling people to the way of Allah. Though Nadwi was very committed to the leadership of the ulama among Muslims, he also spent much of his energy seeking to persuade and mobilize laymen, women, and children to do dawah themselves. This was also clearly a motivating factor for Daryabadi. Part of the raison d'etre for his Quran, after all, was to inspire confidence in the Quran and Islam among Muslims in English-speaking settings. All right, number 3. Dawah should be contextual and pragmatic within limits. Nadwi wanted dawah to be fitting to contexts. And this comes out particularly with respect to his writings about Islam in the West and Islam in India. First, Nadwi was a citizen of multi-religious, pluralistic India. As I have argued elsewhere, Indian Muslims have, for the most part, preferred gradualist, non-political approaches to Islamic activism from the British colonial period onward, and Nadwi follows in that vein. Secondly, Nadwi was closely associated with the Tablighi Jamaat and with Jamaat founder Muhammad Ilyas. In his important biography of Ilyas, Hadrat Maulana Muhammad Ilyas or Unki Dini Dawat, one sees Nadwi's own daology on display as he praises Ilyas's dawah program. A program that focused on the grassroots revival of Muslim piety. In fact, in the introduction to Nadwi's biography of Ilyas, it notes that Nadwi wrote the book precisely to describe the spirit of dedication and religious ardor of its founder and to explain the rules and principles of Ilyas's dawah, presumably so that others perhaps could imitate it. One concrete example of Nadwi's pragmatism comes from his work in India. In order to foster better interreligious relations, Nadwi put much effort into his Payam-i Insaniyat, an organization meant to bring Muslims together with non-Muslims over common concerns. Nadwi and his biographers stressed that Payam-i Insaniyat was meant to build bridges with non-Muslims precisely in hopes of convincing them to embrace Islam. So it's an example of a contextual and pragmatic approach. Number four, dawah should be uncompromising about the finality and exclusivity of Islam. Another area in which Nadwi appreciated Daryabadi and which reflected his own daology was in holding to the exclusivity and finality of Islam. Take, for example, this excerpt from Daryabadi in which he is commenting on Ali Imran 385, which says, and this is how Daryabadi translates it, "And whoso seeks a religion other than Islam, it shall not be accepted from him." Daryabadi comments as follows: "This repudiates the comfortable doctrine that all religions are equally good and that different paths adopted by different nations and different grades of society converge to the same divinity. All roads lead to the top of the mountain, right? There is one straight line possible between any 2 points. So even so, there is only one true, perfect, and sound religion. All other religions are but so many deviations." As another example, we might take a look at another characteristic of Daryabadi's Tafsir that Nadwi would also have liked are the sharp contrasts he draws between the Quran and Islam's manifestly correct view and the misguidance of other religions. I counted dozens of examples as I read through the 4 volumes of this phrase, "in contrast to." Everybody will say, "This contrasts with," or this stands in contrast to what the Hindus believe. This stands in contrast to what the Jews believe. This stands in contrast to what the Christians believe. This is my own notes, so just to show you some of the examples that I found, if that makes any sense to you at all. That certainly is a unique feature. Daryabadi, being from India, not only addresses himself to Hindus, not to Christians and Jews, as is typical, but also to Hindus and Hinduism quite frequently as well. Number 5, and this is the final one. Dawah should be urgent and uncompromising in the presence of religious competitors. And so again, as I began, I mentioned that I was going to be using the lens of interreligious relations, and so we come back to this. From the very first dawah of Islam preserved in the Qur'an to the present, dawah has always taken place, one might argue, in the presence of competing dawahs. For Nadwi, the urgency of dawah was heightened in his time by the efforts or false dawahs of Christian missionaries, proselytizing Shuddhi groups or Hindu groups that were seeking to reconvert Muslims, the Ahmadis and others. He was also deeply concerned about Shiite dawah, and as I said, the dawah of the Ahmadiyya. For Nadwi, since all these competing dawahs were in danger of leading Sunnis astray, they had to be strongly counteracted by a scriptural and practical Sunni dawah as outlined above. On this point, it is interesting that while Nadwi was vigorous in his rejection of what he considered false religions and false sects, he still tended to accept the logic of the modern religious marketplace. Sorry, I lost my place there. Namely, that all religions should have the right to propagate themselves, particularly in contexts like secular India. Indeed, it is here that Nadwi often held out India's Muslims as an example for Muslims elsewhere in the world. For Nadwi, Muslims around the world should emulate Indians who have held firm to their faith and been faithful in dawah in the challenging context of pluralistic India. Given its focus on comparative religion, it's no wonder then that Nadwi liked Daryabadi's English commentary. So there you have it. In this paper, I have briefly introduced Daryabadi, Nadwi, tried to bring them together. I bit off way more than I could chew in this paper, obviously. I have much more I could say about this interesting translation and commentary, but enough is enough. Thank you for your time and attention.